Shalom. My name is Mottel Baleston, and the program is Our Messiah is Jewish. For many years, I served as Messianic rabbi at a Messianic Jewish congregation in the New York City area. We had many wonderful opportunities there to celebrate holy days, holidays. As a Messianic Jewish congregation, we regularly celebrated Hanukkah every year it came around. Some folks were a little maybe concerned about that. They said to us, well, now that you are believers in Jesus, now that you are Christians, shouldn't you be celebrating Christmas? And our simple response was, we love to celebrate the birth of Jesus. We would happily celebrate the birth of Jesus, but we may choose to celebrate it a little bit differently than you might. For the next couple of episodes, we'll be talking about the holiday of Hanukkah. Now, Hanukkah is a Jewish holiday that very curiously is not mentioned in the Jewish Bible. But rather, Hanukkah is mentioned in only one place in the Bible, and it's in the Christian New Testament. So that's a pretty unique thing in and of itself. So I'm going to be turning and reading to you from John chapter 10. So it's the Gospel of John, and I'll be looking at chapter 10, where we find the only mention of the Jewish holiday of Hanukkah, and it's found in the New Testament, and particularly in a book that some people occasionally will say, oh, this is an anti-Semitic book. It's not a book that is for the Jews. And you can only say that if you actually haven't read the book and if you don't understand the context of the book. But here, let's get back to the issue of Hanukkah. And so our very simple statement is this. Hanukkah is a wonderful holiday. It's a Jewish holiday. And the only place in the Bible that it's mentioned is in what people normally think of as the Christian New Testament. And it's here in John chapter 10, verse 22. So let me read the portion to you. John 10, verse 22. At that time, the feast of dedication took place at Jerusalem. It was winter, and Jesus was walking in the temple in the portico of Solomon. So very simply, what had happened here was that each and every year, the Feast of Dedication, which is the phrase Hanukkah. The word Hanukkah in Hebrew would be translated to literally Feast of Dedication. I know that occasionally you'll see it translated as the Feast of Lights, but no, that's not a literal translation. That's more of a devotional sort of extrapolation. But the word Hanukkah is dedication. And so here in John chapter 10, in verse 22, Messiah Jesus made it his business to go up to Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the eternal capital of our Jewish people, the only capital the Jewish people have ever known. It was the Jewish capital for our Jewish kings David and Solomon. It was our capital for almost 1,000 years. And then we were occupied by the Romans, and other nations occupied it for a while. And it was never the capital of any other nation. And of course, in 1948, upon the reestablishment of the nation of Israel, it once again took its rightful place as our capital. And that's where I say this because some people tend to dispute it. But that's where the Parliament building is. That's where the head of state, the prime minister, lives. It is the capital of Israel. And it was the location of the temple, the holy temple to which Jesus went. So Jesus, who is the holy representation of God, the holy second person of the Godhead, is here going to the temple, and he made it his business intentionally to go there to be part of the observance of this feast of Hanukkah. Jesus was a Jew. That sits just fine with a number of you, but there are individuals out there who imagine themselves to be Christians for whom it is a troubling statement. And that's very sad. Even the Samaritan woman at the well recognized that Jesus was a Jew, and she said, "How is it, sir, that you, being a Jew, ask water from me, a Samaritan woman?" Time and time again, we're told that Jesus was a Jew. When Jesus was a child growing up in Nazareth, and December came around, what holiday do you think he looked forward to celebrating in December? I'll give you a minute to think about it. If you answered Christmas, think again. There was no such celebration as Christmas. The holiday that Jesus looked forward to celebrating was Hanukkah. Now, very clearly, Hanukkah was celebrated in a much different fashion back then. It was certainly a minor holiday. It didn't have the sort of festivity that Hanukkah has now. But we're going to be taking this time to talk about this holiday of Hanukkah. It's important that believers understand its historical background and understand why it's important to you today. Now, I'm all for the celebration of the birth of our Messiah. It is wonderful when friends gather in December around Christmas festivities and they read the story from the book of Luke about the narration of the birth of Jesus. I could happily join in such festivities. But oftentimes those festivities are joined with cultural aspects that are very European, culture which is not my own. It is known to me that there are people in the Middle East who are Jewish people who are believers in Messiah, and they celebrate the birth of Messiah, but they may choose to do it in different ways. All I'm asking for is a little understanding when it comes to the very simple fact that different people in different locations are going to observe, celebrate, and remember the birth of Messiah in very different ways. And as believers, we ought to allow them the leeway to do that. But here in talking about the holiday that Jesus looked forward to, the holiday of Hanukkah, this feast of dedication, let's say a few simple facts about it to place it in context. First of all, it's not a biblical holiday. In other words, it's not one of the 7 holy days which God commanded in Leviticus chapter 23. As such, it is outside of the commands, but nevertheless, I have no doubt, and I believe you'll see this when we finish, that certainly God orchestrated, God ordained the events around Hanukkah so that it's very understandable and fitting that we celebrate it. So I promise I'm going to make the history as painless as possible. I know that for some people, history is not something that they delve into joyfully, unlike myself. For enjoyment, I'll watch a historical program. But the history is very simple, and it's not too difficult to understand. Many people understand that between the writings of the Old Testament and the New Testament, there are a period of a little over 400 years. And some Christian commentators have referred to those 400 years as the 400 silent years. And they talk of them as being silent because there was no writing prophet. There are no books of the Bible that occur in that time period. In your English translation, the last book in the current English order is the book of Malachi. In the more original and probably more authoritative arrangement that's found in the Middle East, the book of 2 Chronicles is the last book. And for good reason, because 2 Chronicles, at the end of 2 Chronicles, is the very last part of the chronology of the Old Testament. But nevertheless, don't get concerned, because it's all the same books, it's all the same writings, it's all the same exact verses. It's just that the order of books are in a different arrangement, and the order of books in our current, for instance, our King James Bible, that is a relatively recent invention. The order of books was not in Bible times. So there was this 400 silent years between the end here of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament. But those 400 years were anything but silent. There were many things that were happening in the land of Israel during those 400 years. Let me summarize them again as painlessly as I can very quickly. When the 400 years start, the Medes and Persians are in control in the land of Israel. And the Medes and Persians are the fourth world power. They had defeated the Babylonians. And the Medes and Persians are certainly a lot easier to get along with than the Babylonians. Because while the Babylonians took our Jewish people captive as virtual slaves into Babylon, when the Medes and Persians conquered them, the Medes and Persians said, all you Jews are free to go back to Israel if you want. However, the Jewish people had been in Babylon for 2.5 generations, and because the Babylonians allowed them a day off per week, they had made lives for themselves. And many of them elected not to go back to Israel. You would recognize the names of 2 of them who elected to stay, and those are the individuals Mordecai and Esther, who show up in the book of Esther in the Bible. They are 2 Jews who said, well, no, we're going to stay right here because we heard that the Persians treat their subjects very well, and that you'll give us as Jews, you'll give us a significant amount of freedom, so we'd like to stay, thank you. And they did. A minority went back to Israel. So the Medes and Persians reigned for a while, and all of a sudden then, around the year 323 BC, again, we're going kind of backwards here, because we're going from the earliest BC time periods, and we're going forward in time. So around 323 BC, a young man came out of Greece, out of the Grecian areas, by the name of Alexander. Alexander the Great put the world on its head. In a few short years, he had conquered all the known world in the West, and he conquered all the territories of the Medes and Persians, and now he became the fellow who was the boss of the Middle East. He also said to the Jewish people, hey, you're free to practice what you want to practice as long as you pay your taxes, and the Jews did. Well, long story short, alcohol took an early end to Alexander. He was a drunkard, and he died at an early age with his 4 generals splitting up his kingdom. 2 of those generals, Seleucus and Ptolemy, were the 2 generals who split up the Middle East. Now, the Jews were kind of caught between these 2 generals. These 2 generals would constantly fight back and forth, each one wanting more land. And that brings us to the time period of Hanukkah, which is around the year 168 BC. The Jewish people are there under the Seleucid pagan empire, and more the Seleucids are tightening the screws, saying, you Jews need to worship our Greek gods and goddesses. You need to start bowing down to these Greek soldiers. Alexander was a nice guy, but we want you to lose this silly Jewish religion, they would say, and you need to bow down to these pagan idols. They try to enforce pagan culture on our Jewish people. And when we pick this up on the other side of the break, we'll be talking about how the Jewish people resisted it in a band of soldiers called the Maccabees.
Attention! Did you know that if only 1,500 partners donated $30 a month as water bearers, this would more than cover GLC's day-to-day operational expenses? Plus, any amount above that would go to hiring much-needed help and would ultimately serve GLC's growing need to fulfill its mission, to bring the gospel to the ends of the earth. Think of that. It would only take 1,500 water bearer partners at $30 a month to put GLC back on its feet. Won't you consider becoming a water bearer to help grow and fulfill the ministry of GLC? Remember, we're currently holding an active fundraiser that we call Onward and Upward, and we'd like you to be a part of this crucial time of giving. So please give online or mail in your monthly pledge through the information on your screen. Together, we can make a difference.
Hi there. We're back, and we're continuing our discussion about the holiday of Hanukkah And we're talking a little bit about the historical background of Hanukkah as we continue this segment where we are considering that there are holidays like Hanukkah outside of the scripture that actually have a big effect not only on Jewish history, but on Christian history as well. And so let's pick up where we had left off. The Jewish people were back in their land, in the land of Israel, but they were under the thumb of the Seleucid Syrian Hellenistic Empire. Now that's a big bunch of words. The Seleucids were one of the generals was named Seleucus, and he took over from Alexander the Great. He believed in all of the Greek gods and goddesses, like Zeus and Venus and all of these Greek gods and goddesses. The Romans also embraced those gods and goddesses. Initially, when Alexander the Great took over Israel, he allowed the Jewish people to have their own religion. But increasingly, his successors, those who took over from him, tried to force the Jewish people to adopt Grecian pagan culture. And that meant stopping the teaching of the scriptures, stopping circumcision for their sons, as is commanded in the scripture, and going and starting to go to Grecian temples. It turns out that a few Jewish people wanted to fit in. They wanted to assimilate. They were willing to abandon the worship of the one true God, the God of heaven and earth, the God who created the heavens and earth. And they were willing to abandon the true faith and start with the worship of these Grecian pagan gods and goddesses. But there were still some stubborn bands of Jews who would not do this. So ultimately, the Seleucids, who controlled Israel from Syria with their paganistic Hellenistic culture, they started to insist that Jewish people bow down to these idols that the Greeks would parade through the Jewish towns. And so it brings us to the actual story of Hanukkah, where about the year 168 BC, turns out that the Seleucids were tightening the screws. They were encouraging and trying to force Jews to worship the Greek gods and goddesses. And the way that they would do this is to take a group of soldiers, like a small band of soldiers, a dozen soldiers or so, and they would go from one Jewish town to another Jewish town with a small idol, with a Grecian idol. And it would be borne with 4 carriers, and these men would go from town to town. They would assemble all of the Jews into the center of the town, and they would command them to bow down to these Greek gods and goddesses, and that if they didn't, it would be upon the pain of death. Many Jewish people were succumbing to this, and whether or not they were pretending, whether or not they really believed it, many of them, at least outwardly, did what the soldiers wanted, bow down to these idols. But then the Grecian soldiers came to a little town just outside of Jerusalem, a town by the name of Modi'in. And there's still that same town just outside of Jerusalem, Modi'in. And the Grecian soldiers came to Modi'in, and they placed the small Greek idol in the center of the village. And they shouted out and they called for all of the Jewish people to come to the center of the village to bow down to this idol. And the story that is told by the rabbis, it was written down many years later, so we're not sure if all the details are correct. Some people imagine that it's apocryphal. Some people believe it literally happened this way. But as the Grecian soldiers were trying to force the Jewish people to bow down to the idol, there was an old Jewish priest of the priesthood line there, of the Aaronic priesthood. And he got increasingly angry as the Greeks made their speech, tried to convince people it was modern times, you Jews have to abandon Hashem, you have to abandon the worship of the one true God, and you need to bow down to these idols. Well, he kept getting madder and madder. And finally, when the Greek soldiers sounded a certain signal, it was time for everyone to bow down to these idols. And the rabbis tell the story in the Jewish writings, in the Midrashim, in the Targumim, they say that Mattathias, this old Jewish man who was standing watching this happen, along with his young adult sons, he got so angry that he rushed up to one of the Grecian soldiers, grabbed the sword out of the holster of the sheath from the Grecian soldier, pulled the sword out, raised it in the air, and he said, "Whoever is on the Lord's side, follow me." And with that, he brought the sword down on the head of the Grecian soldier, killing him. And of course, at that moment, everyone is stunned that this old Jewish man would do this. His 5 sons, his young adult sons, look at him, and they see the Greek soldiers advancing on him with their swords drawn, and all of his sons now, well, Pop did it now. Now we're in the fight. So they jump on the Greek soldiers, and they're wrestling, and they're fighting, and the swords are clashing, and all the townspeople jumped in to help this family of Mattathias, this godly old retired Jewish priest. And at the end, the pagan Syrian soldiers had all been dispatched. The swords were now in the hands of this young Jewish band of men, these 5 brothers. And they looked at one another and they said, "Well, I guess we've just started a revolt." And the revolt was on. And that's how the story of Hanukkah begins. It begins with these 5 Jewish brothers who are now called the Maccabees. Very soon, Mattathias passes away, and the leadership of the revolt passes to these brothers. They go from Jewish town to Jewish town, raising up support for a revolt against the pagan Seleucid Greeks. They say, "Listen, they're trying to stamp us out as a people. They're trying to force us to assimilate. They're trying to force us to intermarry. They want the name of the God of heaven to disappear from the earth. We cannot let that happen." And so the revolt was on. They went from town to town to town, gathering support, and more Jewish men joined the revolt, until finally they were on the outskirts of Jerusalem, of the city of Jerusalem. They fell upon the city, and they were able to defeat the band of Syrian Greek soldiers that was defending the city of Jerusalem. The first thing on their mind is that they wanted to get to the Holy Temple in Jerusalem, the Temple of Solomon, and later on it became the temple that was reconstructed, the Second Temple, the temple that was rebuilt by Nehemiah and the others during the return. So there they were. All they could think about was that Second Temple building. Let's get to the temple. We know the Grecian soldiers have defiled it. So let's get back to it and let's rededicate it to the worship of Jehovah God. And the word, again, dedicate, is this word Hanukkah. So they got to the Grecian, past the Grecian soldiers. They defeated the line of Grecian soldiers, made their way to the temple courtyard, fighting Greek soldiers all the way, finally freed the temple, got into the temple itself, into the courtyard, and they were shocked, they were horrified to see that the pagan Greeks had defiled the temple by sacrificing a pig, a non-kosher animal, by sacrificing a pig on the altar there in the temple grounds and spreading the blood of that pig around the altar area. It was a shocking and horrifying thing. This non-kosher animal, this unclean animal, the pig, was sacrificed there. That's what the Seleucids had done, particularly to rub salt into the wound, to say that we're here, we're the conquerors. But now all the Seleucid Syrian soldiers were lying dead. And it became the job of the Maccabees to go into the holy place, into the temple building itself. And they wanted to restore the worship of the one true God, the God of Israel. Again, they wanted to rededicate the temple to the worship of the God of Scripture. And again, remember that the Old Testament, the Bible, commands the Jewish people to worship God at that temple. So we're not talking about some false religion. Messiah Jesus had not yet walked the earth. The true believers, as we might call them, were located amongst the Jewish people. They were the ones who believed in the God of heaven. They were the ones who were the true worshipers. They were the ones who had received the things of the Lord. They were trying to rededicate the temple to the Lord. So they go into the Holy of Holies. And in the Holy of Holies, they go in, let's roll that back in our minds. They went into the holy place. There are two compartments in the temple. There is the holy place and the Holy of Holies. In the holy place, there are three items. There is the altar of incense, there is the table of showbread, and there is a 7-branched menorah. In Rome, to this very day, there is an arch that you can walk under, the Arch of Titus. And on that arch, it celebrates the victory of the Roman soldiers over the Jewish defenders of the temple. And that's yet there, it was future to the time we're discussing, but it was in the year 70 AD. On the Arch of Titus, you will see this item portrayed as being one of the items of spoil that the Roman soldiers carried away. This is a 7-branched menorah. And in the holy place, in the temple, there was a 7-branched menorah. 3 on either side, 1 in the middle. It was made of gold, and it stood 6 feet high. 6 feet. Check it out in the scriptures for yourself in the Torah, in the books of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. You'll see the measurements there. So in the holy place was this 7-branched menorah, 3 branches on either side, and it looked something like this. We have the evidence from the Arch of Titus. And so their desire was that they wanted to relight the oil, because each one of these was a cup about the size of your palm that held oil from an olive into which a wick had been inserted, and they would light that, and at 6 foot high, it would illuminate the entire room. There was not enough oil to light it the way that they had to. And the miracle of Hanukkah has to do with the fact of the lighting of the menorah. It has importance not only for our Jewish people, but for Christians as well. When we return, we're going to be discussing what happened at Hanukkah, the miracle of Hanukkah, and why Hanukkah is such an important story for Christians. See you then.